So if you just start off with your name, please, that would be really...
Yes, my name is Graziella Feraboli. And I was born in London. My parents were both Italian, and I was 14 when the war broke out and 15 when Italy joined the war.
And where did your dad and mum come from in Italy?
Now, my father came from northern Italy, from Cremona, a rural area near Cremona. And very early on he showed great talent for music, and the violin in particular. And with the help of his parents and a scholarship, he was able to study the violin, get his diploma in Milan, and become a professional violinist. My mother came from Florence, and she had studied the piano and got a diploma in piano, and she was very talented, and so she started a concert career in Florence about the time of the First World War.
Okay, so they were both, so they met in Italy?
No, they were both independent. Now, my father, after the First World War, decided to go to London, where friends of his, colleagues, had already gone and had found work. It was a tough moment after the First World War, and especially for his profession. But he joined his friends in London and found that there were numerous opportunities for him to carry on with his profession, got a job, and settled down happily in London. My mother, on the other hand, who came from, I would say, a well-established family in Florence, and therefore they didn't take kindly to the idea of her going to London, but she went to London to visit some Italian friends. I think it was an excuse, but however, she stayed with them for a while, but she fell in love with London and London life and British culture and the language, and she decided to stay on and go it alone. She too found that there were opportunities for her profession. She left the concert platform because that was very difficult to continue that side of her career, and she became a very, very accomplished accompanist of singers and instrumentalists. And it was during a concert that my father was engaged in and my mother was engaged in that they met on a concert platform, and I suppose must have fallen in love, and they married. And they both decided to settle, to remain in London. So they married, and that's where I was born. And they bought a house in southwest London, and that's where I went to school, to the Laura Trade High School, an English school, although it had a French name. And so there we were, a very happy family with 2 Italian parents and 1 British-born daughter.
And they came after the First World War, which would have been about 1919?
I suppose about 1920, something like that.
Okay.
I would imagine.
And what was life like being the daughter of 2 musicians from Italy?
Well, I suppose I never questioned it. I lapped it all up. I was very happy. It was a very interesting life because both were extremely busy people. My father played for his profession, played continuously. My mother taught a lot as well as accompanying. So the house was lively, full of people going in and out, lots of music. And not that it was an easy life. I'm not suggesting that it was all paradise. It was hard work. They were professional people who worked very, very hard. And I went to this school where I was very happy indeed, but I was never made to feel different. Although I had an Italian, rather unpronounceable name and black hair, I spoke and behaved, I suppose, like an English person. And if anything, the fact of the Italianness was a sort of distinctive feature, which made me very proud of being 2 things at the same time, which seemed to be one up on my school friends. although I mean, I'm not boasting, it's a joke really, but it was very pleasant to know that you had two backgrounds, two languages. I suppose I must have spoken Italian first, I would imagine, but and my parents insisted that I learn to speak and write Italian immediately, even before I went to school. They even held me back 1 year from school, because school starts at 5 in Britain, and they didn't send me to school until I was 6, so that I had already learned to read and write in Italian. And then I suppose at the same time I must have absorbed English, because it never made any difference to me which language I was in. But as soon as I got home, inside the home, we spoke only Italian. And I was not allowed, I mean, I was invited, shall we put it this way, to speak Italian, because obviously they didn't want me to lose what was my Italian heritage, my Italian culture. And as we came to Italy frequently in the summer to visit my grandparents, it was obvious that the child had to speak Italian. They couldn't produce a child that didn't speak Italian.
So I guess this is where your interest for music stems from your parents.
Well, I think it's a sort of DNA thing. I was sitting at a piano by the age of 5 or 6. I was already playing the piano. I'm self-taught at the piano, because they certainly didn't have time to teach me, but I used to ask them questions and they used to help me. But then I more or less got on with it by myself, and I adored the piano and played a great deal. But as I grew up, I found that the voice was something I preferred, and so I studied singing, even though I still play the piano.
So your socio-economic base from your family differs very much, although the reason why your dad went to Britain in the first place doesn't, because it sounds like he went through a process of chain migration.
Exactly.
He saw that there was work available in another country, and he followed people from his own region.
That's right. Well, not necessarily from his own region, but certainly from Italy.
Certainly from
Italy. Yes. Okay. Friends, colleagues, certainly. But not my mother's motivation was different, I think, because she had a very good background at home. She could have stayed in Florence and had a happy life there, but I suppose what she fell in love with was the freedom of London, the freedom of British life, whereas with a very bourgeois home she was perhaps more restricted in Florence, but she was a very independent person.
In the kitchen you told me about various places where your dad played, and one of those places where he had his office, was it his office or
his studio? Yes,
was in the Littorio.
That's right. Now, during the 30s, I'm going back a little now, during the 30s, the Italian fascist government wanted to strengthen the bonds, I would say, between the Italian communities living abroad and their homeland and their native country. And to do this, they did a series of things to promote, shall we say, Italian culture. I'm talking of London because that's the city I lived in. I don't know about other cities in Britain. First, the old Italian club in Soho, London Soho, that was moved into a very handsome building in Charing Cross, I think it was, near Trafalgar Square, which was called then, obviously, La Casa del Littorio, which was a fascist appellation, a fascist name. But it sounded good, Casa del Littorio. It was, as I say, a very fine building, which was used for meetings, social events, musical events, lectures, all that sort of thing, and also for social gatherings, so that Italians could feel free to meet together in a venue that was very fine-looking and well-sponsored and well-run. And So that was one thing that the Italian government did. And I must say that it did give the Italian community a sense of identity, a sense of not having lost their Italian heritage, their Italian culture, of being proud of it, and being able to show their adopted country that they weren't just wops, as it were, although I don't think the word existed at the time, perhaps, but that they also had something to offer, and not only to take from their adopted country. Then the Italian government sponsored evening schools for the children, first generation children of Italian residents, Italian immigrants in London. There was a series of schools. The first one was in southwest London, and the Italian consul of the time, who knew my mother, asked her if she would undertake to open up the first school for Italian children in London, because she was a qualified teacher as well. And this she did, and she was enthusiastic about the idea. So they rented rooms in a school, classrooms in a school, first in Stockwell, then in Brixton, and twice a week for 2 hours at a time, these children, who lived in homes where they only heard dialect, more or less heard dialect spoken, were able to learn to read and write in Italian, and also learn about Italy, its culture, its geography, its history, and so on. So that was another way that the Italian government had of strengthening this bond and gaining a hold on Italian nationals living abroad. Then there was a third thing they did. They had holiday facilities in Italy. They used to call them colonies, but they weren't really. They're colonie. They were places at the sea in Cattolica, in Rimini, in Tirrenia, where the children of Italian immigrants could, I'm not sure whether it was completely free or whether they just paid for the journey, or whether they, I don't think they paid anything for staying there. They had in shifts a couple of weeks in the summer in which to have an Italian seaside holiday. And then at the end of the summer, before returning to their adopted countries, they would all gather in Rome, and there'd be a very big display with all the children from abroad, Italian children from abroad, in the Foro Italico, in the presence of Mussolini, of the Duce. So that was another way of getting Italian people to be aware of their country, even though they had adopted another country. Another thing that they did in London was to rent a large sports ground near Edgware. From time to time they rented this large sports ground, which lent itself to big events, displays, and so on and so forth. And very often there would be important visitors from Italy. I mean, I can remember as a child seeing Guglielmo Marconi as a visitor. I think he came to the display in Edgware. I can remember Mussolini's daughter, Edda Ciano. She came on a visit, and I can still remember her at the Edgware sports ground display. Then we had the tenor, Beniamino Gigli. He came to the place, to the Casa del Littorio, and gave a recital, and so on and so forth. Those are the ones I can remember, but there were many others. So all this sort of gathered grist to the Italian fascist mill. I will say this, though, that I don't believe that less than 90% of the people, 90% of the people involved, the Italians involved, had a remote idea of what fascism was. I mean, they knew that Mussolini was a dictator, was the leader of Italy. They knew there was a fascist regime, but they only saw the perks of the regime, the schools, the Casa del Littorio, the lovely holidays, and so on and so forth. I don't honestly think that they knew what fascism was really like, but then neither did a lot of the commonplace Italians. They just took the perks and didn't think very much about the lack of intellectual freedom and all the rest of the implications of fascism. So my parents never belonged to the party. My father was totally apolitical. He was not a political animal. He was a musician. He was a very simple person, in a way, very hard-working, very much bent on his profession, and very obviously loved his original country. He loved Cremona and the brothers and sister he'd left behind, but politics just didn't come into it. Working with Italians and sometimes with the Casa del Littorio, where he had his studio and was teaching violin to a large number of young people, was just a venue for work. It was an opportunity for work. And so it was for my mother, too. Obviously, they were proud of being Italian, but I have to say this in all sincerity, fashion did not come into it, as it didn't for most people.
Would it be fair to say that many Italians who had left Italy before fascism even arrived in Italy
exactly
were flattered by this new interest that someone was taking from Italy in developing Italian culture?
I would say that you've hit the nail on the head. Exactly. That was the whole point. I mean, that was the whole point that the Italian government wanted, and that was the result that it obtained. They were flattered and proud to be part of all this Italian movement, quite detached from any political. Mind you, there probably were perhaps a small number of people who were fascist-minded. But then there were many British people who were sympathetic to fascism at the time, in the 30s, who were sympathetic not only to the Italian fascists, but to the German regime as well. So, and members of the British upper middle class, not to say even more than that, were sympathetic to these regimes. That is until the late 30s, I would say.
It sounds like things were okay up until the point when Mussolini began to have visions of grandeur in the sense of creating an empire. You were in Britain at the time when Mussolini started to do this. What was the reaction then when he began to say, tread on the toes of the British in Africa, because they had their colonies right next to where Mussolini wanted his? The Mediterranean started to be. Did your relationship change, or did it just remain the same when that happened?
Well, don't forget I was a child then, and therefore I don't know how much I would have absorbed that. I know my parents probably thought, what on earth is he doing? But I don't think that I suppose they were living in a fool's paradise. So many people were living in a fool's paradise. They might even have been among a section of the Italian community in London, a sort of pride in the Italians showing their mettle, because after all, the Brits had created an empire, and so Mussolini was creating a tiny little empire. There could have even been a matter of some pride. I can't really answer that question because I was too young to know. I know that my parents would never have talked in those terms.
So I guess that was in 35 then. So in 39, when the Second World War erupted, you would have been 14?
I was 14.
As you said before. Can you recall your feelings?
Well, yes, exactly, because it so happened that we had our last summer holiday. I mean, I said before we were living in a fool's paradise. We went abroad in the summer of '39, leaving my father at home to work because he couldn't take time off from his profession. So my mother and I trotted off to Italy to visit our relations in the end of July 1939, and got caught on the hop in Cremona on the 3rd of September 1939, which was the day war broke out. Okay, we came up with a shock because my mother was really very, very concerned. But she was concerned because Daddy was in London and we were over here, and we couldn't get back because we couldn't get visas to get back. So we had to stay. We went to Florence to my grandparents, and we stayed until mid-September, I think it was towards the end of September, when we finally managed to get a visa, and we crossed France in a blacked out train, crossed the Channel, and got back to London. And that was a shock, because all of a sudden I knew life wasn't going to be the same as before. Got off the train at Victoria Station, blackout. I'd never seen a blackout in my life before. Obviously. An atmosphere of a very sombre atmosphere. My father, very, very dark-faced, although we were delighted to meet again after the summer, but there was it was serious. I could feel that the situation was serious. Gas masks all over the place, balloons in the sky. It was a totally different London. My school evacuated. It was in Portsmouth, near Portsmouth. So within days, my mother packed me off to my school in Portsmouth. And I shall always regret the last few months of my father's life. I was not at home. I was at school. So I don't know how my parents lived those intervening months. But from what I gather from what my mother said, they were still in a fool's paradise insofar as they knew there was a war on and therefore things were going to get tough, and they were prepared to toe the line. But I don't think it ever occurred to them that my father could be touched in any way, that he could be arrested or detained, which is perhaps the better word, because he was not a criminal, so he wasn't arrested, he was detained. But you can imagine the shock on the 11th of June at 6:30 in the morning when there was a knock on the door. I was at school, so I'm telling you what my mother then told me. Two apparently very pleasant-mannered, plainclothes detectives, policemen, knocked on the door and said, "Mr. Feraboli, will you please get together a few things in a suitcase, because unfortunately we have to detain you for a short while." So that's what he did, and that was the last he saw of his wife and his home, and he was taken off to a detention camp. And meantime, my mother called the school and said to the headmistress, the Reverend Mother Superior, "Send my daughter home immediately." And within the day, the Reverend Mother had called me and said, "Look, Italy has joined the war." And I can remember stupidly looking up at her and saying, "But surely on the side of the Allies." And she just looked at me with a sort of funny sort of smile, and she said, "No, I'm sorry." And so she packed me onto a coach, and I arrived at Victoria Station, where my mother met me. And the first thing she said as I got off the coach was, "Your father's gone. They've taken him away." She was a very direct person. There was no nonsense about her. She just gave it to me straight between the eyes. "Dad's gone. They've taken him away and I don't know where he is." So we got home, and that was the beginning of the incubus, of the nightmare. We didn't know where he was. So frantic phone calls all over the place. The Italian embassy was closed. The police knew nothing, and I'm sure they knew nothing. They didn't know where they'd taken him. The local police, I mean, that had arrested him, detained him, I'm sure they didn't know where he had gone. He'd been sent off somewhere. We didn't know, nobody knew. And there were hundreds of other Italian families in London sharing the same fate. And we telephoned round to a lot of friends, and they said the same story. No, they would. The husband was taken away in the morning, and we don't know where he is. And then there were 3 nightmarish weeks in which we just didn't know where to turn. We were running round in circles. And on the 3rd of July, my mother opened the Telegraph. We used to get the paper every morning. The Telegraph used to come through the letterbox every morning. She took up the Telegraph, and on the front page there was the heading, ship torpedoed, Italian, German prisoners fighting to get into the lifeboats. It was a horrendous reportage of the sinking of the Arandora. And my mother just looked at me and said, "That's where your father was." She was a very sensitive person, and she just said, "That's it." You can imagine the shock. And of course it was true. But why did she say that? Because the day previously, the morning, the 2nd of July, in the morning, I had left my bedroom and rushed into my mother's room, crying, really weeping and saying, "I'm never going to see my father again, I'm never going to see my father again." And I had no reason to say that. And my mother was very cross with me. She said, "Stop it, sort of, don't say such stupid things," and so on. The next day she read this news on the Daily Telegraph, and that's why she said, "That's where your father was." She remembered that the day previously I had had this, and I have always felt that it was 6 o'clock in the morning, or about 6:30 in the morning, when I ran into my mother's room crying, and I have the feeling that there was telepathy between my father and myself in the moment that he was drowning. I'm sure all when the thing happened that he thought of his family, and the thought was transmitted. And I've never forgotten that moment. After which, my mother, being a very practical person, gathered things together and said, "Now we've got to start getting information," which was the last thing that we could find, because nobody knew anything. More phone calls, because other people had read the news. Therefore, we were in touch with other families, but nobody knew anything. The Brazilian embassy had taken over from the Italian embassy, but they knew nothing. The police knew nothing. So we were wandering around in a fog until some days later, but I think several days later, we were given to understand that news could be had at I think it was the Home Office. It was a red building in Hobart Square, which they tell me doesn't exist anymore. The building has apparently been taken down. It was a big red brick building in Hobart Place near Victoria Station in London. And we, on the sort of grapevine, we were told that we might get information there. Well, we rushed there, and we found an enormous queue of Italian women outside, all eager for news. And gradually, one at a time, took a long time, we were shown into an office. We had to give the name and number of the prisoner, as he was called. And there was just a very, very short reply. Missing, presumed lost. No, missing, presumed drowned. I beg your pardon. Missing, presumed drowned. Well, I didn't even understand what it meant. But when it dawned on me, I mean, after a moment's silence, my mother said nothing, and I just shouted out, "But What have you done to him? You've killed him. Is that what you mean? And my mother took me by the arm and got me outside. Outside there were scenes of despair. There were women shouting, crying, one or two fainted, because most of the answers had been the same as ours. And so that started another period in our lives when we never thought that he might have been picked up. A lot of people were, of course, and even some of our friends were fortunate enough to be picked up. But somehow my mother never had that hope. She, from the start, knew that he had gone. And so she set about reorganising our life because no more money was coming in. There was nobody working. And so what she did was, we had a 4-bedroomed house, and she immediately set about finding 3 paying guests. I moved into my mother's bedroom, and we let 3 bedrooms as for paying guests, which kept us going for a while during the war. And well, that's about it. Then the Blitz started shortly afterwards, because this was the end of July, August, and then I think it was in September that the Blitz started. So we had we had plenty of trouble. In the meantime, we had been asked to surrender our radio, because as Italians, because we were enemy aliens then, you see. Well, my mother was an enemy alien. I was a British subject, but my mother was an enemy alien. So we couldn't have a radio. That was confiscated. And the Blitz started, and my mother felt a little uncomfortable about shopping in the high road, because we had ration cards, of course, and her accent, although she spoke English very well, but it was with an Italian accent. And I believe that she must have had some rather nasty remarks said to her. So at the beginning she was a bit nervous about exposing herself along the high road for shopping. But our English friends, and we had some, they were bricks. They were really marvellous. Our English neighbours really went to great lengths to help us. For the first few days my mother was so stunned she wasn't even cooking or doing anything. I remember going for meals to our neighbours. I mean, I had most of my meals with them because my mother was either not cooking or running around looking for news and information. What I didn't say earlier was that my father, we discovered, was detained in a camp in the north of England. Wharf Mills was the name, I think, of the camp. He had managed to send a letter, censored, of course, on special paper that was given to them to write, and then it was said opened by the censor in English, in his broken English. And he was obviously terribly concerned about us. He had no news. He knew nothing of what was happening to us. So he wrote a very short note, but being my father and always being very serene and not wanting to worry my mother, he said he was fine. He was with a lot of other Italians, and there was nothing to worry about, but he was very worried about us. Could we please send him news immediately? Well, I think my mother must have done, but I don't think he got it, because shortly afterwards our neighbours received not another letter. My father wrote to our neighbours saying, I have no news of my family. Would you please keep an eye on them and eventually let me know if they are all right? And again he said, I'm in a place where it's rather like being back at school again, in boarding school, he said. You can imagine You know what the conditions were like in Wharf Mills. You know the humiliating conditions in which the detainees lived, where they were sleeping on floors. It was a factory that hadn't been used for years and years and years. They were sleeping on straw on the floor. There were no bathroom facilities. They were given poor food. But he said, "Oh, don't worry about, tell my wife and child not to worry about me. I'm fine. It's like being back at school again," and so on. And then in this letter he said, "Tell my wife to pack a few things for me, because they tell me we're going to be sent to another place and I shall need one or two things. I'll let you know what I need." So this must have been prior to being taken to Liverpool for embarkation on the Arandora. And there again, whether my mother replied or not, I don't know, but he never got the letter. So he died not knowing what happened to us. And we lived not knowing what happened to him until that fatal day at Hobart House.